Hopefully it doesn't sound like we're recording through a potato this time.
Hopefully it does not sound like we're recording through a potato this time. All right, welcome everybody to Comp and Coffee. Thanks for joining us today. We have a really interesting topic to talk about, and it's something that we hear about a lot, and that's communication. And now, obviously, communication has a lot of different fundamentals behind it and a lot of different wide-ranging ways that it can help you beyond just comp. But we're going to really focus on how compensation can better communicate the art and science and everything that goes into what it does today. I'm Sean Lavana. I'm joined, as always, by Katie Rosa.
Hi, everyone.
And we look forward to talking about this today. This is something we're extremely passionate about. You can understand how to communicate. It applies to a lot of different areas of your life. And one of the stories we told on a recent webinar we had about this is I was speaking with a college freshman. He's a business major. He's trying to figure out what to major in and why. And I said, look, at the end of the day, one, there's a whole lot of other advice that goes along with this. One, look for what you're interested in and why that clicks. But if you can figure out how to communicate and do it well, then you can do almost anything else that you want to do. It applies to everything. And so what we're going to talk about today is specifically how it relates to comp and why this needs to happen more with comp. So one of the things I want to note that came up recently on this webinar and on roundtables that we had is okay, we get it. Comp needs to better communicate, but why? And the reason is this: it comes back to marketing. It comes back to building your brand and your department's brand. And there's the great quote that, I don't know, this could be one of those made up anonymous quotes that I've heard along the way, so don't fact check me on this, but LBJ supposedly said that if you say something 17 times, they'll hear you on the 17th time. So people's perception of you comes from what you repetitively say. And so we'll talk about ways today that you can overcome that. But, I think it's fair to say, Katie, traditionally comp hasn't communicated well.
Not at all. And I don't think that's, we're not trying to place blame here on comp. It's just, it's not within your immediate wheelhouse necessarily.
No blame at all. That when I get overwhelmed and busy and I'm trying to do my day-to-day job, that I don't communicate out with the company as to what's going on all the time, and that's bitten me more times than I can count. But I think that's the same thing here in comp, right? You have your day job, and it's something that somebody isn't intricately aware of what happens in compensation. They care about the end result in a big, big way, but they don't know how that number gets derived, right? And that's because traditionally comp was this dark art. It was a little bit of a science, right? Let's take the surveys and let's see what other people are paying, and let's take our cut of that, and then let's apply some art to that by figuring out how we want to move that data forward and use it in our organization. That was the tradition, and because of that, a lot of departments still operate that way, right? It's a need-to-know basis. A lot of times when we've talked about communicating comp, that people come back to us and they say, well, this isn't really well received in my organization because they like to keep it quiet. Yeah. And look, let me be clear before we go into this. We're not advocating that you go out and share everybody's salaries, but you should communicate why your company pays where it pays. If it's the median, which we know up to 90% of people pay out there pay at that rate, then communicate why. Listen, we want to pay where the market is. We don't want to pay under that. We want to reward you for doing a good job here.
And communicate what that means. I mean, we
absolutely.
Before the webinar that you just mentioned that we held recently, we did a pretty informal survey, and we found that 72% of organizations have a comp philosophy, but 51% say their employees don't understand it, and 38% say that their managers don't understand it. So, what's the good in that? Yeah,
right. So just saying like we pay at the median or we pay at the market, right? Like
what does that mean?
What does it mean? Translate. That's one of the key tips that if we emphasize anything today, communicate in their language, and you do that by speaking plainly, saying what you mean, not throwing all the jargon terms around.
Write it like you'd speak it.
So, and I think there's a huge opportunity here because compensation, like we just talked about, is something that every single person cares about. Comp people invest a ton of time in making sure that they're getting paid right. They've likely have all these processes and data and sophistication around that data and standards around that data that goes into play with this. And they hold themselves to a standard. They hold their vendors to that standard. And they make sure that it's accountable to all of their processes, sophistication that goes into receiving and handling that data, and so they can apply what they need to apply to get the answer that they need to get. The problem is, employees have no idea what goes on, right? They just get, for example, if they're a candidate, they get an offer sheet that's like, or an offer letter that says, here, we're going to pay you this. And you're like, that either seems good or it doesn't. And, as a manager, hopefully going on behind the scenes that there was something going into that. Maybe not, but hopefully. But employees certainly don't know, and especially when they're in your organization, it's very rare that they know everything that goes into determining why they're getting a raise, why they get bonuses, right? All these kind of things.
So then when they're trying to make a case for a raise or a bump or whatever, they're going to go to the crowdsource sites and try and find the data there, which may or may not be accurate.
And because they believe that is the source of data, that's going to be, that's going to be what they take to a manager in your company, and they're going to say, here's what I should make. And then, the question is, do you believe that manager is well equipped to have that conversation? Do they understand the rigor and sophistication of everything that goes into comp and why the company pays where it pays?
And just think of the problem that can ensue if the manager doesn't, if the manager has no idea, and not just the difficult conversation that they could have, but that could, that could leave an employee completely checked out afterwards if someone can't back it up and say, here's what it is and here's why it is that way and why this number is wrong or not right for you, Joe Schmo.
Yeah, either way, it's going to come back to comp, right? The manager's either going to say, yeah, you should make this, I guess, right? Let's go check with the comp department. Or they're going to say, I don't know, let me go check with comp. Or they're going to say, no, because, right?
Yeah.
Either way, they're not good answers, and either way, it comes back to comp. So, and it puts you on your heels when they're coming at you, you're defensive, right? As opposed to if you're offensively communicating why this is the way it is and helping managers understand those and helping them with those conversations, then you're in a much better spot to be able to equip your advocates to advocate.
But what can we as comp professionals do to help employees and managers understand what goes into pay? Like, where do you start?
It's a fantastic question. That's why we're here today. So you start with communicating, but what does that mean, right? What is good communication? What is effective communication? Effective communication is saying something simply that educates your audience and motivates them to take whatever action it is that you want them to take. In terms of comp, it's a couple different levels that we'll talk about here, and that's your wheelhouse, which is personas.
Yep. Yeah, so you want to talk to not just your employees, but you want to make sure that you're communicating with your managers and with executives. I mean, those are the three types of people you should be communicating with on a regular basis. And there may be more at your organization. There might be some layers there, but those three are guaranteed. To back up for a second, personas are just that. They're just a collective representation of each type of individual that you'll communicate with. So you're going to need to do some research to investigate each of these types. So you'll need to ask them some questions, and actually we have a resource that we could share with you. We can put in the we'll put in the show notes for this episode that you can download to help guide how you figure out who those different audiences are at your organization. But basically, the questions you want to ask will be around demographics, their motivations, their goals, communication preferences, things like that. Long and short is that it should be your goal to understand each persona and their drivers very well. That way you can determine how you should be communicating with each of them.
Right, and then it really gets into, well, how do you effectively communicate, right? So you understand who they are, what they care about, what drives them. And then I think a lot of organizations, it probably helps to cut this by at least what level are we talking to? Mm-hmm. And what do we want them to do? So let's talk about effective communication first, and then we'll talk about those different levels. Effective communication, first, it should be something that gets their attention. And this is going to be likely different for each level that we talk about, right? So levels are like execs, managers, and employees, like we just talked about in the personas there. Same kind of thing that we're talking about. What that communication should seek to do is not be an FYI. It should not be, hey, I'm sending you this, here's our comp rangers, or hey, I'm sending you this, here's a budget spreadsheet for blah. Should not be that. It should be something that gets them engaged, which means it has to be as personable as possible, relatable, say it simply, say it in a language like you talk, and meaningful to them. The meaningful part is pretty easy in comp.
And you should be creating it with your action or goal that you want them to take in mind.
That's right, and that's
the start.
That's the end result. What is it that you want them to do, right? And so you figure out what drives them, which so if you understand that, okay, I want this to be engaging, I want to make it drive somebody to do something, and then I want them to take that action, right? So those are the couple of things. And you do that, you're going to have to test the different ways to do this. You can do it through different mediums, email versus intranet versus posts on the wall versus
lunch and learns,
Slack channel, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Whole bunch of different ways to do this. And then so the different mediums, engage them regularly. So even if it is an email, if you have a regularly recurring email, but it's fun to read or engaging to read or great information in it, then that can build up an audience too, right? We shouldn't just tune out emails because most people are bad at it. You can actually be quite good at it if there's something, interesting and repetitively interesting in the sense of like you can have a series of emails around that. And then finally, what action do you want them to take? So those are the three things. Get their attention, engage them by figuring out what drives them, and then get them to take that action.
Yeah, so like Sean said, those are the goals. But how do you know what to communicate or, who to communicate with? The first step is that you have to ask the questions, and then you've got to listen. So I actually have a really good example of a comp manager who did this at her organization. She's honestly like the poster child for everything that we're talking about in this episode today. Her name is Tori Finucane, and she's the comp manager at Colette in Rhode Island. They didn't have a comp function before Tori, so when she started, she knew she needed to sit down with management and just see where their heads were at when it came to comp. So she sat down with all the execs and managers for an hour each individual, and began first by just asking them some general questions like what challenges has their team recently been up against, their short and long-term goals, things like that. Then she would ask a series of questions that helped her get a baseline for each person's view and understanding of comp, things like questions about pay competitiveness or pay performance, internal equity, those types of questions. And she did all of this listening and edged in questions where appropriate to guide them and really got to learn about her target audiences at Colette.
So I can't emphasize enough how important listening is. That's the foundation of great communication. So now that we understand who we're talking to, hopefully what drives and engages them, and we start to build those personal relationships. The one-to-ones in that listening tour are critical in starting to build that foundation for her.
Yeah, they really helped her get a baseline of how comp was viewed at her organization, and also it helped position her as a strategic partner, which is hugely important. And she was able to break down some of the barriers between comp and the rest of the organization.
And then, so on top of that, you'll start to be able to figure out how they like to be communicated with, right? So executives might like dashboards, graphical things, communication that ties into the company metrics, like if they care about attracting and retaining the best talent. Are we doing better with our time to fill? Are those people staying around longer? Are they engaged more or not? I think those are the critical messages there, and continually reinforcing those things and tying comp to those things. For example, there might be other metrics that your organization cares about, but those are what's critical to helping have comp viewed as a more strategic business partner. And again, we talked about it earlier, saying it over and over again, so mapping to those things continually shows the value that you're providing to the organization and how those are changing when things change within the compensation department or the broader HR organization. So that was the executive example. The other two things to make sure we're talking about here, managers, they're going to need to understand a lot of the detail as to why a decision was made or why you're communicating something, because they're your front line. We need to enable them to be our advocates, and they need to communicate these things a lot of times to employees, or even if they're not communicating them to employees, they need to answer those questions that are going to come back. Mm-hmm. So as much as possible, be transparent with managers and even give them answers to questions that they might anticipate. And then to employees, again, take the same stuff that you communicate to managers and distill it down to a simple level of what they need to know that's actionable or very relevant to them.
In their language.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
No jargon.
And the reason why we're talking about all this today, and the reason why this is a huge thing, is it's information asymmetry, right? That's what we're hoping to tackle. We want to be able to get comp on the same plane as, on an understandable plane with employees, that it's not just I get, paycheck, or you determine what I'm paid or what I'm going to get what raise I'm going to get this year. It's that both sides have a better understanding of what's going on, to remove that dark art, to remove those arcane, traditionally arcane and mysterious processes, and have more of a conversation around why the company pays what it pays and what that means and everything that goes into that. There's a ton that we crammed into today. We are going to put a bunch in the show notes around resources that will help you develop personas, resources that will help you determine what areas of the organization you need to communicate with and how you might be able to do that. Our goal here is to start a conversation. This is something that we are obviously passionate about and something that we want to continue to advocate for and help with. We hope that this is the start. So check out the show notes. We'll have all the links to relevant information in there. And hit us up with any questions. We're on Twitter. You can email us, whatever's easiest.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.